Hello, VEST scholars, and welcome to this module where we're going to discuss Earth system science in general. You guys are all familiar with systems. You interact with systems every day. Even just your body, of course, is a system full of subsystems, your endocrine system, your circulatory system, and so forth, all of which work together to make you who you are. You also interact with systems outside of yourself. Your home is a system where processes are occurring. Your school is a system where processes are occurring. So likewise, like nature, you are interacting with systems all the time, and one perturbation in one of those systems can have significant effects on you. And of course, sometimes things happen that have amplifying effects, that amplify problems in your life or amplify good things in your life. And sometimes things serve to rein you in within the system or rein aspects of your system in so they don't get out of control. These are all different things we're going to talk about briefly in this presentation. So I'm going to start off with this image you have in front of you. Imagine for a moment you're standing in this forest and you run across this tree that's been cut down. This tree, as an individual, is its own system, just like you are. This tree probably has moss growing on the north side of it. Probably has lichen growing all over it. Probably in the canopy of this tree were nests where birds existed, or where other organisms. Certainly, insects were living in the bark and in the branches. Perhaps some other fungi were living in those areas as well. And of course, this tree also was a part of the forest canopy. So as a member of the forest, it provided an important a couple of things. It holds the soil in place. It absorbs light before the light can filter down to the bottom of the forest floor where plants are living that are adapted to live at the forest floor like that under lower light conditions, such as ferns. And of course, when you cut this tree down, you're not only destroying or killing, ending the system that the tree is individually, but you're also, although on some level, perhaps it's a species, not in this case, perhaps it's a species that uh, is able to survive based on growing out from its roots. Say the tree of heaven, for instance, or ailanthus. Regardless, when you cut a tree down, you significantly affect its own system, but you also affect the systems around it. So let's look at this a little bit as we analyze systems. If we do cut this tree down, let's look at the question of deforestation and think about many trees. If we deforest, we're not just interacting with the four spheres here: the hydrosphere, the atmosphere, the litho or geosphere, and the biosphere. We're also causing things to happen within or between those other spheres that are, that are sort of a cause and that are indirect cause. That's the word I'm looking for, or that are indirectly caused by the direct action of cutting down trees. So let's talk about the direct actions first. Of course, as you deforest, you increase CO2 to the atmosphere because now it's not as much CO2 is being pulled out of the atmosphere. You thus also decrease the amount of O2 being put into the atmosphere because you're affecting respiration on the plant respiration. In the hydrosphere, you're going to make adjustments to the amount of water that's taken up by the tree that was once there. You're going to have an effect on the amount of transpiration that's occurring within the hydrologic system. On the lithospheric side, or the earth side of it, you're going to potentially affect or increase erosion of the soil. And on the biosphere side, of course, you're adversely affecting habitat. And of course, as we go beyond that, between the hydrosphere and the lithosphere, you're going to see an increase in runoff into streams and eventually into bigger bodies of water, which also brings with it sedimentation, more sediment runoff. You're going to be diminishing the amount of soil available for microbes to survive in. As we think about that, you're also going to be leading to more warming of the atmosphere, which adversely affects the biosphere in many ways. And then, of course, evaporation rates are going to go up as well because now you have more forest floor open to more intense sunlight than you did before. So there's a lot of different effects that occur, and of course, every single one of the spheres is affected by a change that's made in one. So what we do here echoes in eternity is kind of a cool phrase. But in some respects, there's a lot of truth to that. So everything that happens in the biosphere has direct effects on things around it, but also indirect effects on other systems. So if we think about the Earth as a set of subsystems like your body, we can divide them up in a variety of ways. In this prior slide, we looked at we divided up as the hydrosphere, the atmosphere, the biosphere, the lithosphere. Here, this slide does the same thing, the lithosphere, biosphere, atmosphere, and hydrosphere. So we have the solid Earth, we have the living portion, the living things on the Earth, including humans. We have the gaseous part of the Earth, and we have the water part of the Earth. But here, this person has divided up the hydrosphere into the hydrosphere and the cryosphere, and they put between the solid Earth and liquid Earth because the cryosphere is the ice portion of the Earth. And it behaves differently. It does behave differently than the water portion of the Earth. So there's an argument that can be made to separate that out. Here's another version of it. If we break up the Earth into its subsystems. In this case, this person didn't call it the lithosphere anymore. They called it the geosphere. And then we still have the biosphere and the atmosphere and the hydrosphere. No cryosphere this time. But this person separated the anthroposphere out, which would be the humans as their own sphere, because humans are at this point a very outsized, as far as the rest of the biosphere, are outsized in their impact on the planet, and really are a force of nature in and of themselves. And this, of course, the separation of the anthroposphere out does make a really big point about our impacts. More on our impacts later on in the course, but in all of this, it's important to not forget the exosphere, because without the exosphere, none of these other spheres, I shouldn't say they would exist, but they wouldn't interact with each other, and the biosphere might not exist actually without the exosphere, because the exosphere is the space environment, which includes the sun, which provides our primary source of energy. So, of course, thinking about that energy, as that energy from the sun, the exosphere, comes into the Earth, that energy drives all of these systems, all the action in these systems. So initially, of course, that energy interacts with the atmosphere, and of course, part of that are clouds. Some of that energy is reflected back into space. Some of it makes its way all the way to the land surface, where shortwave or shorter wavelength energy is re-radiated to space as longer wave energy by the land. And of course, the oceans behave differently than the land. The land is generally a lighter color than the oceans. The oceans almost act as black bodies, absorbing all the radiation. So the oceans tend to be good thermal heat sinks in that regard. And so this energy, of course, this energy budget, fluctuations in this energy budget are really, really important to understand, and can have significant effects on the hydrosphere, the geosphere, and the atmosphere. Not to mention, of course, the cryosphere, and we'll look at here in a moment. Take this coral reef community, for instance. Within this ecosystem, of which this community is a part, you can see several spheres in action. The first one that might come to mind for you could be the biosphere. You've got a bunch of living things here. What you don't know is that even within the biosphere, you have organisms that are relying on each other. The fish over here, all these swimming organisms, everything in here is relying on the coral itself. Tropical waters, where the coral live, tend to be very nutrient poor. And the coral reefs are really what provides the driving force behind the biosphere in these locations. So coral reefs, for instance, are themselves living in a mutualistic situation or life with an algae, zooxanthellae. And of course, for those algae to exist, you have to have light, because the algae are photosynthetic. And so because they're photosynthetic, they need to be near the ocean surface. The coral polyps themselves have tentacles that need to move around as they filter feed. And the interaction between these two organisms, where the zooxanthellae provide organic material and oxygen to the coral provide nutrients to the zooxanthellae. And so if this relationship breaks down, the entire ecosystem can break down. And ocean acidification and things of that nature, the warming of the ocean, these two variables can have significant effects on the ability of coral reefs to keep the algae, and rather than expelling the algae at times when coral reefs go and bleach. But there's other Things going on here, of course, we have exchange with the atmosphere, where we have gases being exchanged constantly. So there's an amount of dissolved oxygen in the water, there's CO2 in the water. The hydrosphere itself, of course, the water has to be there. You have to have, again, wave action for the coral to survive. The geosphere, the land, erosion of materials, weathered materials from the land, provides the bicarbonate and calcium that the organisms here can use to make their shells and their skeletal structures. So, of course, the oceans are salty because of weathering and erosion off of the land. So that's important to remember. That's where all these ions come from to make life possible. And of course, all of this is driven by the exosphere, energy coming from sunlight. Now, there's that cryosphere example. Here's the cryosphere. Here's the hydrosphere. You can see how dark in color this ocean is. So, sometimes we talk about these interactions between systems, as we did in the last slide. But we have to also point out that sometimes there's perturbations in the system that cause a disequilibrium to form. Everything's going well. Things are in a situation of stasis. Life is good, and then something happens, right? And then we call this, if something happens, there's a perturbation in the system that affects other systems, that can then lead to other downstream effects that can actually amplify that. And an example of that here is this. You have energy coming in from space, from the exosphere. Some of that energy bounces off of this white ice, reflects back out to space, is not trapped. Some of that's trapped, but not all of it. The oceans, they're very dark in color, absorb a lot of the energy, and so will actually be a kind of a heat sink, and sort of act as a sort of heat sink. Now, if you warm the planet through CO2 emissions, and those CO2 emissions actually keep a lot of that re-radiated long-wave radiation down in the troposphere, what we call global warming. If you then do that and the ice begins to melt, now you have the amplifying feedback of albedo actually causing the Earth to warm more, because you'll have less white ice reflecting energy back to space and more darker ocean absorbing it. So the oceans will warm more rapidly, and that leads to more melting of the ice, which leads to more warming. This is what we call an amplifying feedback. Sometimes these are called positive feedbacks, but the term positive is a bit problematic sometimes for some, because it denotes this idea of a good thing, right? These aren't always good things that we're talking about. So this is the system, the amplifying feedback that occurs here. Further global warming leads to higher temperatures, which leads to less ice and less sunlight reflected, which leads to more open water and more sunlight absorbed, which leads to further global warming. Now, you can also have the opposite of this, what we call a dampening or a buffering feedback. Typically known, sometimes also known as negative feedbacks. But again, these aren't necessarily negative things. What they do is they buffer the problem. So they can rein it back in, if you will. And the predator-prey relationship is an example of a buffering feedback. So when you have abundant prey, you can support many more predators. Good Malthusian stuff here, which then, of course, will deplete that prey population. And when you have fewer of those, you can support fewer predators, which then allows more prey to occur or to be able to reproduce. And you can see how that can play out over time with regard to the give and take of predator and prey populations. So this is how things are kept in balance. All right. Now, if you have a situation where you have abundant prey and something else is killing off all the predators, and this is kind of the situation you have with humans overhunting wolves, say out in the American West in the late 19th century, then that can become an amplifying feedback to produce other problems down the road. But still, the basics of amplifying and dampening feedbacks are really important to understand. So, for instance, let's go back to our example of deforestation. If you cut down the rainforest in the Amazon, which has been big in the news this particular year, all right, you have fewer trees, which means less water pumped into the atmosphere. Rainfall is going to decrease. Temperatures, and of course, as temperatures are rising, these two things, the decreased rainfall and the rising temperatures, lead to drought and wildfires. We've seen this occurring in the Amazon, which leads to more trees dying and decomposing and then burning, which leads to more temperature rise because part of that burning is a release of CO2, not just from combustion, but CO2 carbon that's been stored in that forest floor, in the wood itself, because that is a source of carbon for many, many years. And of course, this becomes an amplifying feedback to the warming that's already occurring from other situations. It's really, really important to understand how all of this works. And so part of NASA's mission, the Earth Science Program specifically, is really, really focused on understanding these interactions and these systems better. So here's just a short list of some of them. I'm not going to go through all of these, but there's a short list, and there's many, many, many more past missions, present, and then even planned missions that NASA's conducting to help us understand our planet and its subsystems much better than we do already. And so to give you an example of some of these, you can pause this here if you want to sort of look at these. There's a great website that describes NASA's Earth observation system. But take the A train, if you will. It's called the A train because it's actually a constellation of 5 satellites flying in close proximity. The 5 main ones are Aqua rather, CloudSat, Calypso, and then Aura. There's a couple of others, Parasol and Oko, that are part of this as well. But they're flying in close proximity, and they're called a train because they're able to, the A-train formation allows for simultaneous coordinated measurements. And then so data from these different satellites can be used together to obtain comprehensive information about atmospheric components or processes all at the same time. So in real time, and this allows us to study the interactions in real time, because when you combine this information simultaneously from these different sources, it gives you a very much more complete answer to a lot of the questions than would be possible from any one satellite alone at different times. So these satellites all cross the equator within a few minutes of each other at around 1:30 p.m. local time, and so you can tell when they're coming. You can actually predict when they're coming, but the 2 primary satellites in the A-train that contribute to hurricane research are Aqua and CloudSat. And then the other satellites provide important information about clouds and aerosols that assist with hurricane research in particular. But they also provide data that can be used for a variety of other things also. Of course, Oko is focused on CO2 emissions. So again, there's a lot of satellites out there, but it's important to note that a lot of these Earth observing satellites that NASA has out there are designed to work in conjunction with each other like a system. And of course, like a system, they're working together and they provide the information we need, but they're also going to need to be replaced from time to time or added to. And so, again, just using that as another analogy to help us understand systems. But again, this is how NASA has designed its missions with that in mind. So for now, that's our discussion of Earth systems. Again, if you have questions, make sure you address them to your master teachers. Otherwise, I'm signing off for now. So until next time.